Marshall pedals. More specifically, this Marshall pedal. Well known and revered, accepted as a great sound and distortion pedal, but that is getting more and more difficult to find, especially in good condition and at an acceptable price. And at the same time, we get this newer version, say Mk.2, Mk.1 perhaps we should call them, very easy to find, often below $50, and it seems to have a good reputation for a solid build. So the question is, can we make this sound a lot more like this? Let's figure it out. Here we have two versions of one of the most famous distortion pedals ever, the Marshall Guv'nor, Mk.1 and Mk.2. These are all known, and chances are you've at least come across them at some point, with many of us actually owning them. There is no question regarding the quality of Mk.1 as a phenomenal sounding distortion pedal, while Mk.2 is often disregarded as even bashed by most. This is why in this video I will exhaustively analyze both pedals, and I will detail how to modify a stock Mk.2 to exactly mimic the sound of a Mk.1 with added versatility. The original pedal Mk.1 was produced for a brief period of 3 years, which explains why there's scars. And since the construction leaves much to be desired in terms of reliability, they have steadily gotten more and more expensive. The updated version, commonly referred to as Mk.2, was a replacement for the original issue and was Marshall's answer to a few of the problems that the old units had, such as cases which were not very sturdy, knobs and jacks that would break a bit too easily, and foot switches prone to premature failure. While they managed to fix all of this, they also wanted to adapt the sound to the new, more aggressive tones of the 90s, and so the circuit was slightly different, louder, darker, and with an additional bass control labeled deep. This new control intends to allow the user to dial in a profound bass that would resemble that of a big stack, but it also makes the pedal a lot more difficult to dial in, and in many cases it just results in a muddy distortion that lacks all clarity. What we're going to do now is modify a stock Mk.2 so that we can get the best of both worlds from this cheap and readily available pedal. A very solid case with all durable hardware, quality components, and the original sound in a compact unit. And the whole thing won't set you off more than a couple dollars and a few minutes with your soldering iron, so what's not to like? But before we start analyzing the circuits, let's take a look at the hardware itself. Here's an early Mk.1 from 1989, made in England, and in remarkably good condition, by the way. In this particular unit, everything is well preserved, so we'll be able to test it and use it as a reference to verify the simulations and for later comparison with the modified Mk.2. If we take a quick look inside, we can see that it consists of two PCBs, one with all the connectors and another with the circuit and potentiometers. The boards, which appear to be made of a rather good-looking blue phenolic compound, are laid out in the most straightforward fashion, with all the components lined up, parallel and clearly labeled, making this unit super service-friendly. The switch, which has a terrible reputation for prematurely failing, doesn't look any special and feels absolutely normal when operated. When it comes to the Mk.2 hardware, we should make a short remark, as I have found that there are at least 2 revisions of the hardware. After carefully comparing them, I found out that the circuit is the same, and so are all electronic components used, except for the circuit board. The older Mk.2 dates from the year 2000 and was manufactured in India, while the newer is from 2006 and came from China. This wouldn't be of any interest if it wasn't for the board labeling in the earlier version, which states GV1, whereas the newer is marked GV2. I don't have a clue as to why they would produce the exact same circuit in 2 boards with these 2 different names, when in fact both are Mk.2. In any case, there seems to be no circuit difference between them, so if you are in the market for a Mk.2, any unit should be good. In terms of hardware improvements, it's well known that the case is extremely sturdy, and that the new Alpha branded potentiometers are solid, metal jacks are of much higher quality than the ones found in Mk.1. Although there are no apparent electronic changes between the two revisions of the Mk.2, there exist indeed small aesthetic differences. The late Mk.2 mounts a foot switch with a slightly wider shaft, flatter jack nuts, knobs with a wider spaced engraved pattern, and a front logo that appears to have a deeper relief. As a final note, I'll add that although both of my units were in almost mint condition, it was clear that all the potentiometers in the early Mk.2 version had a lot more give than those in the newer unit. You can see that if you try to wiggle them a bit, the newer version is much tighter and solid. It's clear that they kept working and improving the hardware of the Mk.2 for a while after its initial release. If you ever search for information regarding these pedals, you would likely come across the infamous C22 mod. There are countless websites where people describe how removing a capacitor inside the Mk.2 will help you get a more clear tone that is close to the original. And while doing so will certainly give your unit more presence, it will also make it a bit harsher and will still be quite off the sound of a Mk.1. So I thought it'd be worth showing that it's not the best idea if you want to improve the sound you are getting out of your Mk.2. Here I have plotted the frequency response and the linear operation of the two versions plus the one with the C22 mod. In the top plot, all EQ controls are set to the minimum, in the middle one to 50%, and in the bottom one to the maximum. The red trace corresponds to the Mk.1, the solid green to a stock Mk.2, and the dashed green to a Mk.2 with the C22 mod applied. While it's clear that the C22 modded unit is certainly closer to the Mk.1, especially for mid frequencies, it's still far from correct, most importantly for low and high frequencies. So while yes, the presence is recovered, the EQ shape is still wrong regardless of how you set the controls. And this is why we'll need to fix the EQ block if we want to get the exact same tone. Another major point of concern for a lot of people seems to be the operational amplifier. The original Mk.1 used Motorola branded TL072 chips, while the new Mk.2 used the same type but a newer revision manufactured by Texas Instruments. While the new chip is assumed to be a direct replacement, it's not entirely straightforward to compare them as their behavior when saturating can vary, and is not as accurately described in the technical documentation as we'd like it to be. This is probably why many believe that the new ones don't sound as good. I wanted to know if there's any truth to such claims, so first I compared the datasheets for both chips, discovering that they are indeed almost identical in every parameter that matters when operating under linear conditions. It is only in the maximum output swing where the difference appears. The new Texas Instrument chips are capable of a larger output swing of approximately plus minus 500 millivolts for the same supply rails when compared to the vintage Motorola's. Luckily for us, this difference can be easily compensated for simply by lowering the supply rails in Mk.2 with the addition of two extra 1N4007 rectifying diodes. While some detractors of the Mk.2 often comment on the Opamp, as I mentioned before, it seems to be of general consensus that the clipping diodes are just the same in both units. This might surprise some, but they are not exactly identical, although they are very close, to be honest. I've analyzed several Mk.2 and Mk.1 units, and I've come to the conclusion that the diodes used in the old pedals have a slightly lower forward voltage of around 8%, which is irrelevant, and I'll explain why. With the scale tone stack, they achieve mostly one positive thing, which is a slightly lower noise floor. Since the resistors and potentiometers have much lower values, they'll introduce a lot less noise. I can see that the reason for leaving R12 and T12 unscaled was to preserve the waveform clipping characteristics, but that results in a major change of the base response. If we scale these two components to match the EQ block, the diode's soft knee beginning will be offset by about 0.3 dB, and when they're fully on, the volume will approximately be about 0.5 dB lower than it was. Now, these differences are so minimal that even the nominal tolerance in the components is going to make up for it from unit to unit. So long story short, it doesn't matter. So scale the parts that were left untouched and you'll get the right results without any other issues. The modified EQ block in Mk.2 required different resistor and capacitor values between the second operational amplifier and the clip-in diodes to achieve the exact same tone control as in Mk.1. This will have a very small impact in the produced waveform that, although not hearable, can be measured with the proper tools. The worst case scenario is shown in this plot, where an input signal that only briefly makes the diodes conduct can be observed to have a very slightly different compression shape. This is purely anecdotal, and I thought it was interesting to show, if any, just to calm the dissonant voices. Now that the operational amplifier is patched and the clip-in diodes are validated, it's time to discuss the last block, the deep control. As I introduced it before, its original purpose was to provide the user with the possibility of getting a much heavier bass, in the way a big stack would. That's why this peak filter is located at approximately 80 Hz. The problem with the inclusion of this new block is twofold. First, it does not allow the user to completely dial it out, as even when turned to the minimum, will still accentuate the bass by about 8 dB, a way too large amount to be fair. And second, because when dimmed, it will greatly risk introducing clipping distortion at the output stage, a totally undesired effect. With these two problems in mind, I redesigned this block to give the control a wider range of actuation, such that when turned down to the minimum, the dip control becomes effectively bypassed, but functioning normally otherwise. The redesigned block only replaces 3 resistors and 1 capacitor, keeping the existing potentiometer intact and at the same time avoiding having to add a mod switch to such a good-looking box. The dynamic range limitation is also overcome in the redesigned block, as the relative level between the resonant peak and the passing band is now variable. This way, accommodating the largest output levels without any risk of distortion while maintaining a good range of the deep control. Now that we have compared both versions and understood the differences between them, let's take a look at the schematic and I'll show you what needs to be done to a stock Mk.2 to get it to the next level. This is the schematic of the Marshall Guv'nor Mk.2, easily obtainable with the help of Google. Let me guide you through it and explain the differences with the Mk.1 and how we're going to patch it up. I'll start from the left side, where the input signal enters the circuit. We have a high-pass filter formed by the 1K resistor and 10 nano capacitor, effectively the same as in Mk.1. The 2 diodes I mark in red are a new addition to the circuit, but they'll only clip the input signal to the supply rails, which is also what the first operational amplifier will do. So they will not alter the tone at all. You can safely leave them in place. The feedback loop with the gain control is preserved from Mk.1 with the 100K logarithmic potentiometer. The parallel capacitor, which limits the high frequency gain, has been changed from 120 picofarad to a slightly smaller value of 100, but the difference is insignificant, and I'll explain that. The worst case scenario showing the largest difference between these two circuits will appear when the gain is set to the maximum. In such case, for a Mk.1, the cutoff frequency will be set at approximately 13 kHz, while for the Mk.2 we'll have a slightly higher frequency of about 16 kHz. Both of these cutoff frequencies are high up enough that either way it won't affect your tone. Moving on, we have a couple additional components in the path to ground from the inverting input of this first operational amplifier. These fed and parallel resistors are there to provide a quiet switching when the effect is bypassed, and are completely transparent when it's engaged, so this part can stay unaltered. The input to the second operation amplifier is exactly the same as in Mk.1, with the detail that they've split the series resistor in 2 halves, simply for a quieter bypass operation. The feedback loop of this Opamp hasn't been changed from Mk.2, but this is as far as it goes before the new version starts to show. What follows is the clip-in diodes block, the EQ section, and the master volume, all of which have been altered in Mk.2. The resistor and capacitor in series with the output of the second Opamp, R12 and C12, are not changed from Mk.1, but since the EQ block has, the effect is that the low frequency response is quite different. So in order to fix that, we need to scale those 2 components by a factor of 10. R12 goes to 10K and C12 to 22 nanos. Next is the EQ block, where all the components, including the potentiometers, have been scaled by a factor of 10. We can leave this block untouched since we've already dealt with the low frequency problem. The joint response will be identical now, since the Opamp wasn't pushing its output current capabilities before, and it certainly won't be now with a higher load. The next part is the master volume, which has been scaled as well to match the EQ block, therefore must remain to produce the same interaction. The difference here comes from the top series resistor that has been added to the circuit, R25. This one needs to be replaced by a wire. They also added a resistor in parallel with the master volume, R26. This one needs to be removed from the circuit. After the volume, there is a low-pass filter formed by R5 and C22, plus obviously the load from the previous block. These components were not scaled as the rest, causing a great loss of high frequency. To match the tone of a Mk.1, they need to be scaled by 10, making R5 go to 220K and C22 to 47 pico. With these changes, the distortion character remains, and we have fixed the EQ and master volume issues that so many people have complained about. The newer Mk.2 introduced an additional bass control labeled dip, which controls the gain of a resonant peak type of filter, tuned to about 80 Hz approximately. Well, I can see the appeal in having this new feature. In my opinion, they made a poor choice when they decided that this block had to be permanently engaged, thus preventing the user from achieving the traditional tone. I personally like the presence of this block in the pedal, especially when I use it with a small amplifier, as it helps me get the punchier distortion. But it makes an enormous mess if you try to use it through a big stack or an amplifier with a lot of bass. So I redesigned this block to give it the range of operation that, in my opinion, should have. Changing these 3 resistors and 1 capacitor will give the deep potentiometer the ability to completely disengage the block when turned to 0, while still providing 8.5 dB of gain when cranked up. Resistor R19 goes to 10K, R21 to 150K, R9 to 220K, and C23 to 47 pico. And the last thing we need to do is modify the power supply part, adding 2 extra rectifier diodes in series with D1, the existing 1N4007 that protects the circuit from reverse polarity supplies. The reason for doing that is that the new Texas Instrument Opamps have a wider maximum output swing for the same supply voltages. Therefore, we need to tame it down to the original span by lowering the rails. I'd like to point out that although the schematics for Mk.1 that I found online do not include the protection diode D1, the actual vintage units do have them. Take this into consideration for your calculations in the Mk.1 circuit. And with all this, our Mk.2 will give us exactly the same tone as the finest Mk.1 you can find, with the additional feature of a handy bass control to fine adjust the bottom end accordingly to the amp you're using. Now that we have our modded Mk.2, we can take a couple of measurements to verify that it indeed works exactly as a Mk.1. First, we can compare both units measuring the transfer function, also referred to as frequency response, which is the behavior of a system when under linear operation. I won't go into many details here, but you can search for linear time invariant systems if you want to know more about this. Well, I measured both pedals, making sure I kept the input signal low enough to avoid introducing any meaningful level of distortion. And from the data I obtained, we can see that they are a perfect match. In the left plots, I displayed both measurements in power and phase, and the right ones show the error, that is, the difference between a modded Mk.2 and the original Mk.1. The deviations both in power and phase are very small and simply due to combined nominal tolerance in the parts. In other words, they are as close as two identically manufactured units could be. Although we know that having the right EQ response is important, the character of the distortion is what we need to nail, since this is, after all, a distortion pedal. I fed another signal, this time with an amplitude large enough to produce a healthy amount of distortion, making sure both the Opamp and the clipping diodes were doing their job. The output waveform from the original Mk.1 and the modded Mk.2 are presented in the top plot. We can see that they are extremely close, again with only tiny differences that can be explained through the nominal tolerance in the parts, mostly the Opamp and the diodes, and the very small error that having a scale R12 and C12 introduce. This error, as we can see in the bottom plot, is always below 8%, which, if you combine the tolerance of all the parts in each unit, is really as good as it gets with two identically manufactured analog distortion pedals, meaning that you can buy two original Mk.1 units and have this or even worse tolerance. With this, we can now be sure that the modifications we made to this Mk.2 have perfectly shaped it to mirror the tone and distortion of an original Mk.1 from 1989. I guess the only thing that's left now is connecting both units and taking them for a test drive, see if they rock. Well, that's it for now. Hope that inspires you to get a better tone out of your Marshall pedal. And if you like the Marshall tone, stick around because very soon there's an episode coming about the JCM 900. Easy to find and cheap, especially compared to other Marshall amplifiers, but what can we get out of it? Can we make it sound better, perhaps like all the Marshalls? We'll see.